Hi, everybody. My name is Eric, and I live on a block on Bank Street between Lisgar and the PN. And so about 2 years ago, it got targeted for demolition, and we're fighting back against this mass eviction. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we've been going through on our block. There's tons of media attention on housing right now. But for every media article or TV audio piece, you're probably not hearing many words directly from tenants. Language in these pieces can work against us, tenants, in various ways. And one of the interesting parts of this process for us has been reclaiming some of that language. And it's been really important for us to take a bit of control over it and speak in a voice that makes sense to us. So I'll start this talk by going through a few examples of that. So what is housing? Housing in Canada is overwhelmingly treated as an investment. And when you hear anything about rental housing, the investor is probably leading the conversation. On our block, one of the first steps in our resistance was to reclaim the function of housing that's meaningful to us, shelter. We painted big window signs for our block, bright orange backdrop with big black font lettering. Simple messages like, we live here, this is my home. So next, the housing crisis. We hear all the time that we're in a housing crisis. And for us as working class tenants, it certainly is a crisis. But our society is not just tenants. We have lots of property owners, people owning several properties. There are people whose entire game plan is to amass more and more property. And for those people, our housing situation is working just fine. I don't know if Ricardo Tranjan is here, but he introduced this important clarification to our block, and he's got a book called The Tenant Class. Affordable. This is a super slippery term because it's rarely used in relation to a specific income level. The city will tell you that they have lots of affordable housing on deck. Oh yeah? Affordable for who? A senior living on basic pension? ODSP recipient? OW? Minimum wage? $25 an hour? No. Student housing. Most students need roommates to keep costs down. Hopping onto a rent-controlled lease is a beautiful thing, but more and more rare. Investors love tearing down rent-controlled buildings with 2 and 3 bedroom units. Perfect student housing, displacing those students to intensify with tiny bachelors. Goodbye rent control, goodbye roommates. This type of build often gains social license with a branding of student housing. In reality, it's hard to imagine new builds that would be more hostile to the average student. This is anti-student housing. Right to return. This one is crazy because it's actually on the books provincially for cases of rent eviction. The problem is that investors can wiggle out of it by paying a fine, which they do every time. Buyouts. Buyouts can mean a lot of different things depending on who's talking. Even housing nonprofits regularly celebrate buyouts as victories. But the vast majority of tenants targeted by investors don't find much to celebrate in buyouts. The violence of displacement starts long before eviction. Constant and steadily evolving stressors, inadequate sleep, frequent illness, plans on hold. Imagine going through years of struggle to keep your home and then floating for 1 or 2 years on a buyout, the whole time contemplating your next eviction because your rent has tripled or worse. So the next part of this, I want to talk a little bit about the conditions on our block. My neighbors and I live in a couple of different 100-year-old buildings. Beautiful inside and out. New windows and a new roof would help them stand another 100 years. And so far in the life of these buildings, it seems that repairs and updates played the role of keeping the property healthy and safe for the tenants. These days, you mention the word update or renovation to a rent-controlled tenant, you probably aren't going to be met with a feeling of relief, but rather panic. Rumors about major updates in a rent-controlled building are almost as scary as hearing the building will be leveled to the ground. That's the rumor we started hearing about 2 years ago on our block. Our block had been purchased with a plan to demolish and redevelop. The investors hoped we would leave quietly last January, but we're still there and we're not moving. Where would we go? We're low-income, working-class households. Some of us have been on the block for 30, 40 years. We don't have cottages, we don't have savings, and in many cases, we don't have parents. What we have for now is shelter that we can actually afford, so we're hanging on to it. A question we get asked frequently is, will you be able to move back in? Yes, the investors plan to build housing in the wake of the demolition, but the question misses the point. These processes, updates, renovations, demolitions, are not about improving buildings or building better buildings. These processes are about changing conditions in order to force maximum increases in property value. Our block was targeted because of rent control. Mass displacement is not incidental to the process. It's pivotal to the process of destroying rent control on our block. So these investors are often described as speculators. But is that an accurate description of what they do? Speculation involves guesswork. Where is the guesswork in investing in a fully legal process of mass displacement so that you can set new rent as you wish, no limits, in a building or on a city block? Does it take a visionary to guess that that process will be highly profitable? No. These investors are not speculators. They're parasites who feed on the displacement of low-income working-class tenants. And they have the whole process sewn up. Almost. On our block, we decided we don't want to host these parasites. And in our neighborhood, we've had conversations with thousands of tenants in the older buildings surrounding our block. And the feeling is that we have to shake these investors off more and more of the time. Introduce an actual speculative element to the housing investor market. The looming question in the boardroom prior to investment needs to become, will the tenants leave quietly? And what will they do to us if we try to force them out? But how do we shake them off? Housing investors are treated with baby gloves every step of the way when it comes to the question of mass displacement. Mostly it's not in the conversation at all. I'm just going to grab a prop. So if you look at the column on the right side, I'm going to read that out. Building community. The existing residential units on the block provided decades-long stable housing for low-income households. Existing tenants will be forcibly displaced in a mass eviction prior to demolition of the current structures. Following reconstruction, fully furnished suites will be offered to new customers at market rate, 3 to 5 times current rents on this block. The newly constructed suites will be exempt from all forms of provincial rent control. So I'll just get rid of this. So obviously that's not a city sign. You would never see those details on a city sign. Okay, so yeah, it's jarring to read that on what looks like a city sign. We made that sign because we hated the city version. The city version existed on our block until last winter. It was silly that it was set way back from Bank Street behind the giant Wallach's trash bins. And it didn't even appear on the other end of the block. It was covered with tags most of the time. Eventually it disappeared for good a few days after being set on fire. But that's not why we hated it. We hated the city version because it said nothing about us. The developer had to submit impact assessment reports on transportation, parking, noise levels, heritage, wind, trees, etc. Mass eviction of current actual existing tenants in immediate risk isn't even in the conversation at City Hall. So, getting ourselves into the conversation, it's a good start. Next, we make the investors own the element most pivotal to their investment, the mass displacement of us. Working class tenants who are often low income, maybe refugees, single parents, caregivers, kids, people with disabilities, seniors, students, artists. Bank Block Tenants deals with these investors directly. We ask the hard questions in their own Rockcliffe Park neighborhood, at their own medical offices, at the nonprofit employing a married partner, on the campuses where students are paying her salary, at the psychotherapy practice of another married partner, on the walls of our own block. So we're treading water. My neighbors and I see our block differently now than we used to. Our homes have become sites of resistance and confrontation. It's difficult to compartmentalize that, partly because the work is endless. As neighbors in our building, we used to watch movies together, go for walks, bike rides. Now, after work and on weekends, we work together. There's no time for anything else. And of course, as we continue to stay and push back, the investors have stepped up the pressure on us. They stopped patching the roof. They served bogus non-payment of rent eviction notices to several of the most elderly tenants on the block. They lie to the media. They lie to each of us, hoping to pit us against one another. They keep trying to isolate us and corner us into individually signing away our homes. On our front doors for many months was posted a photo of a wonderful neighbor who's been helping us resist the displacement, a trespass notice. Call the police immediately if seen on the property. Steady reminder that we live on a block run by delusional parasites. I'll return now to one final note on language, and I saved this one for last because I feel like it's so important for the work that we have going forward to change our housing system. Supply. Do we have a supply problem? Apparently, yes. But the conversation usually stops there. The corner I live at, Bank and Lisgar, tells the story of supply in a much more useful way. There's us, deeply rent-controlled, low-income households, currently targeted by investors. What we have on our block is in extremely short supply relative to demand and is being systematically eliminated. What the investors want to build on our block is very similar to another building just east of the corner, the Soho building. It's easy come, easy go at the Soho if you have the right income. There's always a place for you there. There were 700,000 vacant residential units in Ontario in 2023. Right next to us and the Soho is a vacant lot. For around a decade now, how is all this vacancy and non-use possible? Ownership of rental housing is tending towards a smaller number of larger investment groups with enormous capacity to absorb vacancy in order to push rent. Rent is now determined more through collusion than competition. If you went to the effort to destroy rent control in a building or on a block and you don't have any vacancy in your new build, you're not playing the parasite game very well. So this process of conglomeration will steamroll ahead as long as we keep allowing these developments to succeed. We know if they succeed in displacing us on our block, it just gasses them up to do it again on other blocks. If you or anyone you know are at risk of displacement, we want to work with you. If you're interested in doing work to directly interfere with these investors, we want to work with you. As tenants, it's very difficult to do this resistance work individually. We have much more power to working together on the scale of a building, block, neighborhood, or city. And just a final note, some of you may be wondering, why does he keep specifying working class tenants? It's just the reality that working class tenants overwhelmingly occupy the older, not updated buildings that get targeted by investors. Our block is 100% working class. And I'll bring in an aging reference here. There's no money in the banana stand. There's no banana stand. As workers, we have nothing to sell but our labor. Our wages are largely or fully out of our control. So as a group, our motivations are simple. We need stable housing. Thank you.